Hello, everyone, and welcome to Trigger Talks, a series of virtual events with empowering stories supporting those in the workplace, in the university, and beyond. Here at Trigger Hub, we're about creating conversations that matter, so we don't always focus on the easy conversations. It's more about the ones that actually matter and create a difference and an impact. I am your host, Jess Ward, and I'm the head of content here at Trigger Hub. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with the amazing Dr. Thompson today. We're going to be talking about mental health concerns at university. And of course, we are here today for World Mental Health Day, a day that is very, very prevalent in all of our calendars across the globe, but more so in the university setting. And I think it's amazing that we're all gathered here today for this year's theme, which is mental health is a universal human right, something that's super, super prevalent in universities. So I'm very, very excited to jump into this. But before I go ahead and go away with the kind of key takeaways and the housekeeping for today's event, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that is joining the call today. And also thank you for everybody that's tuning in on LinkedIn as well. I know that we're in two spaces today, so thank you so much. But also, if you do actually support students quite closely, or you've made a remarkable impact, even on just one individual's life, how much that is kind of creating a lasting impact for the future and beyond. So on behalf of Trigger Hub, we already know that you're doing so much. And I think that this webinar in particular and this Trigger Talk, we hope you feel leaving inspired, supported, but also ready to continue making lasting impact. So the key takeaways for today's webinar before we kick off is we hope to cover some of the following. So the common mental health issues that are prevalent amongst university students. We already know that you may already be aware of some of these. I'm hoping that Dr. Thompson will be able to highlight some of them that you may not already know. The early signs and symptoms of these issues. The techniques to approach students who may be struggling. So some of these techniques you may already be doing, which is absolutely incredible. And we thank you for that already. But of course, Dom brings a complete unique perspective to this conversation. Also, the right ways to kind of refer students to mental health professionals or university resources should they need further support. And of course, one of the most important is how to continue to foster a supportive and stigma-free environment for students. So before we jump in and before I, of course, introduce our amazing fellow speaker, I'd like to run through some housekeeping. So please sit back, make yourself comfortable, have a pen and paper at the ready if you're old school like me and Dr. Dom and like to take notes and jot down anything throughout. But I must reassure you that a playback will be sent after this webinar. So should you need to switch off halfway through or you have technical difficulties or anything like that, please let us know and a playback will be sent. So everybody that automatically signs up to this will be sent a playback afterwards. You're all muted by default and cannot unmute yourself. And of course, all your cameras are switched off. So if you're sat in your pajamas, you're relaxing, you've got your feet up, or you're kind of just having your lunch break, please enjoy. You can use the Q&A function throughout the conversation and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible during the end of the Trigger Talk. The answers to all of your questions, including those that are not discussed in the webinar, will be emailed to you after the event has finished. We have lots of resources and downloads that will be available on our Bibliospace platform for those at the forefront of the mental health provision. I will talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the Trigger Talk and how you can gain access to that platform. And anybody with tech problems, fingers crossed you won't, and it will all run super smoothly, please just contact the Trigger Hub team in the comments section. So whether you're on LinkedIn, pop it in the comments, or you're over here on Riverside, please fill that in again. And of course, I would love to introduce Dr. Dom, who requires no introduction whatsoever. And I'm sure a lot of you will already be familiar with Dr. Dom and her amazing work. Dr. Dom is an award-winning GP, young people's mental health expert, with a whopping over 20 years worth of clinical experience caring for students. She's a TED Talk speaker, she's an author and educator, and I must add that Dom is also the author of our incredible student wellbeing series that was published with Trigger Publishing. All the links to her books will be available at the end. So Dom, welcome to our Trigger Talks. Happy World Mental Health Day. How are you today?
Oh, thank you, Jess. Yeah, very well, thank you. Looking forward to a nice conversation because I think people can, find some of these topics a bit challenging. So I think hopefully what we'll be doing is just chatting through some of those things that we deal with every day or not every day, and hopefully reassuring people a little bit that it doesn't have to be too stressful, hopefully.
Absolutely. And providing that reassurance that I think people need as well, because as we know, Dom, people are already doing so much. So it's kind of providing them with more tools. And with Trigger Talks, and of course with Dom being here, our webinars are here to provide you with tangible things that you can go away with. So more of it being a discussion, there's always kind of these skills and tools and tips peppered throughout the conversation. So I think before we get started, Dom, I think it would be really useful for you to know who is actually here, who's joining us, where they're located, what their role is. So if you've tuned in, I would absolutely love you, whether you're kind of commenting on LinkedIn or here in Riverside, please can you let us know who you are, what your name is, where you're located, and what your role is. So if you're in the university and you're supporting students, we'd absolutely love you to know, because this will help Dom and ourselves kind of carve this conversation and make it more personable for you. So
if they can put it in the chat, that'd be great. It's always nice to make sure that we're sort of saying things that are useful to the actual audience who've who've tuned in today. I'd be really interested to see who's joining us.
Amazing. So Dom, to kick off, I would love to just discuss potentially about the mental health issues among students that are quite prevalent in the university right now. So almost carving, I suppose, a bit of an understanding of where we are right now in the university space.
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that everybody working in universities, doesn't matter what your role is really, has noticed an increase in demand for support. I think that's probably not a great surprise to anyone listening. I think the sorts of things that we're seeing and that my colleagues are talking about dealing with much more are particularly around anxiety. Uncertainty about life, lack of confidence in sort of everyday, perhaps what we might have considered everyday activities or, normal things that students usually do, like turning up to lectures in person. So there's been a big increase in anxiety, but we're also seeing, perhaps if I can say, more worrying things like eating issues have gone up significantly. We've seen more perhaps around self-harm. Maybe we'll come back to some of these things later on. It is really challenging because we are trying to support, essentially a demographic, a group of people coming through who have just not had the same opportunities for independence and development over the last few years. And I think that's what's playing out now in many ways, as well as that uncertainty of living through a pandemic and the fact that things weren't already easy before. And the world, can feel like quite a challenging place day to day, as we know if we read the news. So I think that the sort of main things that people will be seeing are around anxiety, and then some of the issues around that sort of spiral out from that, as well as sort of eating issues and self-harm.
Yeah, I think that was kind of a really great perspective on that, Dom. And I think particularly for me, I graduated, about 5 years ago now, and the world is a very, very different place, even just that short amount of time of 5 years. And for me, I definitely struggled with this kind of career pressure. Anxiety was very, very prevalent for me. I find that it's kind of just continued on throughout the university space and the higher education sector. Also, this kind of balancing life. So I know we've kind of got the cost of living crisis now, and it's something that we're hearing all of the time, to the point where it's almost like a normal word that we're using day to day. But I think it is just so prevalent, the anxiety, the cost of living crisis, this kind of eating, the body image, the prevalence of social media in today's society. But then also, like you said, what we're seeing in the news right now, as well as kind of what was happening a few months ago. So why do you think these specific issues are more common in the university setting, that we're kind of experiencing this anxiety and this worry and the kind of balance between certain things?
Yeah, I mean, whilst it can be hard to sort of specifically pick out exactly what is going on for each individual student, the big themes that seem to occur are that students struggle perhaps more than their non-student peers with things like the academic pressure. Obviously, I think that is one of the big differences, and probably the other big thing is financial challenges. So when you add those in to having to find your way in life and independence, and perhaps, issues around housing or having to commute, expectations on you from family or carers or communities elsewhere. When you put all of those things together, it does create a very particular perfect storm for students. And we see, issues rising like perfectionism, which I've talked about a lot in the past, that people may have picked up on that being a theme for me, is that I worry quite a lot about the impact of the rise in perfectionism. If people are interested in hearing a bit more about that, then my TEDx talk, which is freely available on the YouTube, is called 78,000, what I learned from 78,000 consultations with university students. And that focuses on that kind of academic pressure, but in particular the perfectionism and its impact on mental health. So, for many students, the reason that they will then seek help is because things have reached a sort of crisis point, usually around academic or exam deadline pressures, those sorts of issues. Those will be the triggers for them seeking help. And until that point, they'll often just be trying to muddle through. They'll think it's just them and that no one else is struggling and they should know how to do this. And they'll have the imposter phenomenon, all of those things going on for them. But yeah, for students, the main differences tend to be around academic pressure, and then those other things like we mentioned around finance and housing and so on.
Absolutely. I think, of course, in today's Trigger Talk, we'll be, of course, going through recognising those signs, like you said, Dom, and how the students then reach to that anxiety and how they then reach to kind of that imposter syndrome. Is there anything that we can identify before they reach that point, and being quite prevalent in experiencing those mental health experiences themselves, like anxiety, depression, or whether it is just kind of feeling that kind of loss of not knowing where to go next. But in terms of, so that's where we are right now. And of course, we all kind of are very, very much aware of that. But where do you think, or what do you think we will see in the future? Yeah. I know that so many people are making incredible changes in the university setting in higher education. But what do you think? Do you think that will create an impact in the future? Is there more that you kind of expect to see?
I mean, if I had a crystal ball, but I don't. So I'm just going to give you a sense of what I think is going to probably come forward more as an issue, or maybe create more challenges. So definitely, I think we're going to see more neurodiverse students asking for support as they come to university and try and find their way through not only the new experience and the transition to university life, but without necessarily the support and teenage year development that they should have had. They won't have had that because they weren't at school or their schooling was disrupted. So I think our neurodiverse students potentially going to need more support. I think we're probably going to see more students asking for support who have identity issues or challenges, gender or other identity issues. So I think, we're all getting better at talking about that stuff. And perhaps the world is in some places a little more friendly. And I think universities generally and campuses are a bit more friendly to people who might be struggling with their identity, but those young people often need more support. They're often at more risk. So I think they will be coming forward. I have been hearing about the impact potentially of quite a lot of the isolation, in particular on young men, leading them into more misogynistic worlds, incel groups and things like that. And I think that can then have an impact on their mental health, of course, as well as potentially on the community around them. So I think there are things that have been starting to raise their head, and that we've sort of got a sense of some of these things creating more issues. But I think it's very interesting watching how it's playing out on campuses, in communities, with young people. I talk about young people because obviously the vast majority of students are actually the younger age group, but for all students, really, of course, these things can be a challenge. So it's difficult. It's always difficult, isn't it, trying to predict what's going to happen. But if I was running university sort of wellbeing and mental health services, I would definitely be looking around how we're going to support students where these are the sorts of issues that are coming forward. There are other specific issues, like if I medicalise it from an eating issues, self-harm, suicidality, and so on. And that's perhaps another way to look at what services you're going to provide. But I think if we're looking at perhaps the demographics, the groups of students that we might need to support, those may be where I would say I think there's going to be greater demand.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dom. I know that's super useful. And like you said, you don't have a crystal ball to kind of just refer to when you need to.
Not yet.
I think everybody would be queuing up for help with that, Dom. But yeah, that's amazing insight. And I think it is, like you said, it's so important that it's kind of split in two ways in terms of the conditions that may be more prevalent, but also the demographics of people that may experience them. And I think that probably blends in nicely to kind of what we want to discuss, is recognizing the signs, the specific signs and symptoms to look out for in students. So, of course, I know that a few of the people that kind of have joined us today will already be kind of aware of a few of the signs and symptoms, and they may already know of almost like some warning signs to look out for. But what are some of the, maybe not even the most commonly ones, for the mental health issues in students that people may not actually think of?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how familiar you are with supporting students, of course, and some people will be very familiar with this. But I think some people can be surprised by the fact that a student will be struggling, and they will show that in perhaps slightly different ways, like anger, outbursts. In, you be in a lecture setting, or a small group, or a tutorial or something. And the student becomes, really quite upset, and it's all fairly obviously inappropriate in that setting. And I think, anger is often missed, but it's a common presenting sign for depression, for example, more perhaps in males than females, but I've seen it in both. So, that's something to be tuned into. I would also say that erratic behaviour, changes in behaviour, if you're seeing a student who's, turning up under the influence of some sort of substance or alcohol, that is not just being a student, of course. And I think it can be easy sometimes to think, oh, they're letting off a bit of steam, or they've misjudged that. But actually, if that's happening, I would very much want to be having a conversation about how that happened, why that happened. Is it that they are actually somebody who really struggles with social anxiety, and they've tried to sort of self-medicate themselves through a potentially difficult scenario, like going to a lecture or a small group, and they've done that by drinking or whatever. I just think we have to ask ourselves why that would be happening. And I've seen it happen as a GP in a university for different sorts of reasons. So, what are essentially unhealthy coping strategies that people completely understandably look for and rely on to get them through, can have these sort of knock-on effects, or things that people will then pick up on. So, whether you're the academic, the personal tutor, the counsellor, and they've turned up and their behaviour is unusual, erratic, as I said, under the influence, angry, potentially violent, these sorts of things we should be asking the question, why is this happening? What's led to this? So those are really sort of not that uncommon in a university setting, I would say. Just trying to think, I mean, really, the other thing, I suppose, is if their standards are changing. So whether that's their own personal standards, so self-care and hygiene, are not so good. Again, please don't write that off as being a student thing, although sometimes they do live in slightly unsavoury places. I've certainly done home visits to slightly unsavoury places. But if their own personal hygiene is a struggle, then I would definitely be wanting to know more about that. Or if their, academic standards are changing and slipping and a bit all over the shop, again, that's something to just be alert to. So I'll go with those just for now, because they're quite classic sort of student related ones. But yeah, I mean, there are so many ways to pick up on whether people are coping or not coping with everyday life, or feeling well or not. All the usual things like, they're very anxious, or they've had a panic attack in the class, or, just they talk about, being hopeless or being useless, or very negative language, they're a burden, or they feel trapped. Those for me would be big red flags if a student is talking about that sort of thing, and I'd be wanting to speak to them. And separately, we can talk about that in a minute, but it's being alert. If you're alert to these things happening or potentially happening, then when they do happen, you could think, okay, this is where I need to respond. And that in itself is a skill, but it's being aware that these are not just sort of student things or young people's things.
I think something that was quite prevalent for me, actually, Dom, if you don't mind me adding, was I used to do, like, when I suffered with anxiety, it was a lot of social withdrawal. So I maybe might not show up as much in university if there was any social activities or things that kind of involved, whether it was like the wellbeing leads at the university, kind of bringing everybody together for social activities. That was like my worst nightmare when I was navigating, whether it was social anxiety or just general anxiety in general of how to navigate student life, because we're not given that kind of rule book of things to abide by and what to do and what not to do. It's kind of, we're thrown in at the deep end. And that was particularly 5 years ago, but I'm sure that's quite prevalent now. Students are kind of, off you go, like, off to university, off you go. Although it's an exciting time, it's actually, I found it quite an anxiety inducing time, being away from home, being away from, I'm very fortunate to be from a very loving family, and I know that's not the case for many students. But it was kind of that social withdrawal. Do you think that's something that's quite prevalent as well, Dom? Because I know that you had highlighted some of like the physical things that can be quite prevalent, and how students show up quite loud, and that can be quite prevalent and you can see it. But what about those that are kind of riddled with anxiety and almost like struggling in silence?
Yes, of course, you're absolutely right, Jess. That isolating yourself is quite a common strategy for people who are feeling whether it's down or anxious and so on. And I think certainly if that changing behaviour is that they're not attending anymore, and they're not coming when they should come, and not responding to communication, that is obviously also a red flag. I think what's added to the difficulty there is that post-pandemic, a lot of people are just not turning up because they got used to not having to go anywhere. And so there's a real mix of reasons why people are not coming to lectures or events, or, sort of small group teaching or whatever it happens to be. And it can range from the fact that they're too anxious to go there. It may be, of course, your more classic, they were having a line and they overslept, fine. But actually, it's also because they've been told, I suppose, for the last 2 or 3 years, stay at home, stay safe, and so they've got so used to that at a time when it was really crucial in their development of their brain, that they associate being in their room online or doing their lecture online as the safe thing to do, and actually going out feels quite stressful in itself. So I hope that as the years pass and we build their confidence, and we make going to events and lectures and groups and so on more fun and exciting, there will be more reason for them to leave their room. But I think it's going to be actually quite hard to spot those that are withdrawing because of mental health issues amongst those who are just anxious about leaving the house anyway. So yeah, I agree absolutely. Withdrawal is definitely one of the sort of common things that we see with young people or students with mental health issues.
I think that kind of lends on to the initiating conversations, really, Dom, of, I suppose if you have got a student that is under the influence of a substance or alcohol, or you've actually got the other end, which is somebody who's actually quite reserved, and you wouldn't maybe even be able to tell if you kind of weren't familiar with the attitude or kind of personality of that student. Maybe you wouldn't know that they had anxiety, because something it's, when it's to do with mental health, it's not something that always shows up physically. It's something that's in the mind and a highlight. And I think when it comes to initiating conversations, then, Dom, I think there might be two potential answers here. Is, how do you initiate a conversation with a student? So if you were to kind of frame it as maybe a student that was perhaps struggling in silence and had something like anxiety, to then maybe somebody that was, like you said, was particularly angry or having the feelings of anger quite prevalent, How would you kind of structure those two conversations?
So I think, so for me, there's addressing individual concerns. So we'll definitely come to that in a sec. There's also that question, as you said, about how can you tell if that person's just a quiet person? How do you let them know that if they are struggling, that help is available? And I think that's where we have the population-based approaches, those, whether you call them the awareness campaigns or the breaking down stigma that should be done on a day-to-day basis, hopefully around campus. That's how we let people know that if they're quietly struggling inside, then there is help available and they can go here or they can come and talk to you and so on. I think if you're concerned about an individual, that's slightly different. And then you have to pick your moment, make sure that it's a time where that person feels safe and comfortable, that your attitude is caring, compassionate, non-judgmental, not overly assertive, starting with something like, I've noticed this X, whatever it is, and I'm a bit worried about you. I'm concerned for you. I want to let you know that I'm here and available to speak about it, but also there are other specialists, depending on how you're going to phrase it or what your own role already is. You'll let them know that there are specific places they can go where there are trained professionals whose whole job is supporting the students, is helping the students to achieve the things they want to achieve. So I think you've got to make sure that the way that you start that conversation, in a way, is saying, this isn't the first and last conversation. I'm here to say, I'm a bit worried about you. You might not want to mention or talk about anything particular now, but I just want you to know that I'd be very happy to chat if you want to. I'd like to hear about anything. And there's been some interesting research that shows, especially with people who were actually feeling suicidal, but if they heard the word like, as in, I'd like to see you again, tomorrow, I'd like us to talk again, something like that, it was really powerful because it made them feel valued and validated, rather than it was a job that person had to do. So we'll meet again tomorrow or whatever, and it's about framing things so that people do feel that they matter. And it doesn't have to be that you fix everything at that first conversation. It really is about just letting them know that you've noticed something. They're not going under the radar. You are concerned and you'd very much like to help them or help them to find the support they need, the right kind of support. But that, that may need to be through somebody else. I'd also just add that if there are behavioural issues that are effectively, leading towards disciplinary stuff, so, anger outbursts, or I've seen it, for example, with a medical student who was really quite rude and unpleasant to one of the people who the actors who come in and pretend to be patients, in the kind of role-playing stuff. Actually, when they were taken to one side, it turned out there were other issues going on, but there was also this whole risk of disciplinary stuff going on. For me, that's one of the other big red flags. I think students who are going through disciplinary processes are high risk. Not only is it possible that they have mental health issues themselves, not always, I accept that, but I think we have to ask that question. But and this is just to touch on a tricky subject, just in case it's difficult for people, but I do review suicides for universities as an external reviewer. And some of those cases have been students who were going through disciplinary procedures and their own mental health issues were sort of got lost a little bit, probably in some of the process that was going on. So I think, the key here is when you're approaching the student to talk about something, be very open-minded about what might be going on for them, and just very much open to listening to their story and hearing what they've got to tell you, because you might be the very first person that they've ever actually told what's really going on for. And that could be a turning point for them. Your response could be transformational. So I think you have a real opportunity, even if what they've done or what they're doing or turning up drunk or whatever, you are not very keen on, you think, really, this is just not acceptable or whatever, in your own mind, try where possible, because just, it could make such a difference to them having that open and non-judgmental kind of approach. And it isn't always easy, because some of the things that are said or done can be, quite unpleasant, of course, when people are not well. So, it is tricky, but we can make a real difference in how we approach people when they are struggling.
Absolutely, Dom. I really liked that aspect where you said about like reframing the language, because I know that particularly when I was struggling, to be able to talk to somebody in a way that detached them from their role in the university, because I always found that maybe I didn't want to talk to somebody that was, let's say, quite high up in wellbeing at the university. For me, that would have been quite daunting. Something like, oh, will they hold that against how I show up at university? Will they hold that against my score or my contributing grades or how I actually progress on the course? And I think students can, particularly because of the pressure that they feel about maybe this imposter syndrome side of things, but also how they succeed as a student, they may think, well, actually, the challenges that I'm experiencing with my mental health, which may be the first time that they've ever experienced it, or they may have been kind of they may be almost seasoned to it previously, that they may feel like it's almost held against them in some way. So when it comes to having these conversations, Dom, I know that you said about like the language that you use is something I thought that was absolutely brilliant, was that even just like the change of one word can make such a significant difference to how you initiate a conversation. But are there any almost like do's and absolute don'ts of how to initiate conversations, things that you'd be like, this should absolutely not even be approached or even said when having that, even if it's just the first conversation or following up? How would you even begin to do that, or any do's and don'ts?
Yeah, I mean, I think do's are the try to be, compassionate, reassuring, those sorts of things, like being non-judgmental, destigmatizing. Those things matter a lot, and they will have a lasting impression on people. But unfortunately, as you're saying quite rightly, some of the things that people do say, I try not to be too didactic, and I know I can see sometimes they're coming from a good place, or that people have, they're trying to say the right thing, or they're trying to get the right outcome, which is to change someone's behavior, but perhaps not always the most helpful approaches, I would say, are things like making it about yourself. Well, you're making me feel very worried about you, when actually, what you're trying to say is, I've noticed this and I'm concerned about you. So it's, try not to make it about yourself, or doing things like shaming or guilting people is just, it's very unhelpful. Again, I do see where it comes from, but it really isn't great to say, well, it's going to make your parents or carers or whatever feel so disappointed, or think about how so and so will feel about this. Shame is such a negative, awful way to try and get people to change their behavior, and I don't think it has really any good outcomes. So I think it's trying to avoid those sorts of approaches, that whilst I do understand people, it comes from a place of worry and concern and a reaction. Maybe that's where we need to take a deep breath and think, right, what is a human, compassionate, kind way to respond? And often it can just be the listening. It's just active listening, validating people, people feeling like they matter, that you've heard what they're saying, and they don't need you to fix it all. But certainly, I think if I was going to say some don'ts, I'd probably sort of say those ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Dom, I think what you kind of touched on there was that individuals can feel almost quite alone with what they're struggling with, and have that element of procrastination before they even reach out for support. And this is probably a perfect time for me to just mention something here at Trigger Hub, and of course this lends itself, Dom, to your student wellbeing series, is that here at Trigger Hub we shine a light on those that are battling these mental health imbalances through our incredible collection of books, which of course we will talk about yours a little bit further in a while, Dom, in terms of the power of lived experience, and how actually being able to like relate to somebody else's journey as like a source of information, almost that feel of a community, to then be highlighted that trajectory to hope and recovery. And I think that's what it is almost like what you said, Dom, is not kind of making it all about you. It's the individual that's kind of going through it, and they feel so alone, although they're not alone, because there's so many other people that are navigating that, but they just don't know it. So being able to kind of connect them with stories of hope and transition to then give them that light to carry on. And at Trigger Hub, of course, like I said, we'll be discussing that a little bit further towards the end of our conversation about Dom's student wellbeing series and the little bits of lived experience that are throughout, which can help students. But like you said, in the event that a student was really, really struggling and you'd kind of exhausted all sorts of avenues of initiating the conversations, you've kind of been there, you've kind of almost exhausted the resources. In the event that a student actually requires further help, how do you identify when a student should be referred, or what are the kind of the steps that you would take or outline for that next step almost for extra support?
I mean, this one, it very much depends on your role, of course, because you may be the person that other people refer to, but you will then potentially also refer on. But I think for me, there's a couple of things here. So the student needs help when they are not feeling and functioning well for a, persistent amount of time, a consistent struggle. And if I have to put a figure on it, sometimes people say, well, how long is that for? I say 2 to 4 weeks. 2 to 4 weeks of not feeling and functioning well most days is not healthy. So at that point, they're going to need some sort of advice, guidance, support, depending on what the issue is. I think for anyone who is, shall we say, an academic or a non-wellbeing member of staff who's listening in and who's worried and gone through all that stuff and connected with the student, the key there is refer on to the professional services in the university who can advise. So there will usually be a wellbeing hub, wellbeing advisors, a triage team, a duty advisor, something like that, often through an online form these days. So I think for those whose job it is not normally to do the counselling or the mental health advisors and so on, you do not want to be taking on the responsibility of trying to support students beyond just day-to-day compassionate checking in, making sure that they're okay, that they sought the help they needed, that you've picked up on. I definitely don't advise, personal tutors giving out their own mobile phone numbers, all that sort of thing. So I think, refer on is absolutely key, and have boundaries. If you are in the professional services, of course, then you're going to be guided by your own policies, your protocols, and referring up involving the GP and potentially any other local support services, sort of NHS and so on. But I think there you'll be guided by, when you feel you've reached what you can offer that student, it is really important to remember you're not alone as a professional. There are other professionals around you. Even if there are wait lists and so on, there may be some bridging support available. There might be something that is available to help, whether it's a group or it might be an online course. There are various things that might be available for the student whilst they're waiting for the next step in their treatment or in their therapy. So I think the key is, first of all, recognizing that it's reached a point where it needs to be addressed, where they're not thriving, they are not feeling and functioning well, and then referring on to the next level when it has reached your boundary as a professional, depending on what that is.
And I think that probably, I know we've kind of just covered what the initiating conversations is. And I think that's amazing, kind of the steps that you've outlined. But if we were to take a step back and it was like it came to that you needed to refer a student, how would you initiate that conversation? How would you are there any do's and don'ts about referring that? Because I think for me, I was actually referred to a therapist when I was at university because I struggled very much so with an eating disorder and some body image issues. So much so that I kind of had to take time out of my studies, and that required a sense of referral. Now, I was already at that stage where I thought, do you know what? Yeah, maybe I do need a bit of extra help. I don't know what that looks like, but I know I need some extra help. And the way that it was dealt with was almost involving my parents, which is slightly different because I'm very, very close to my parents. So that way it felt more comfortable and more natural, as opposed to a wellbeing lead or somebody like maybe a teacher or a tutor that kind of said, I'm a bit concerned, these are the resources. How would you then take that next step if you think, right, actually, I'm completely exhausted with all resources? How do you then initiate that type of conversation?
I mean, I think the key here is that whatever you're doing, you have to do it with the person, with that student. So the plan that you make has to involve them. The only times I would say when you're not going to perhaps involve them so directly is when they are acutely at risk right then, so, and people will recognize the sorts of scenarios where there is a risk to themselves or others that is very acute. But those are actually quite rare. And the vast majority of the time, the key is to be having a conversation with them. They're part of that conversation about what their options are, what would they like to try, and even just giving people a sense of choice and the fact that they have autonomy over which option they can choose, even if there are only 2 or 3 options and they are, if I can say, not real options, because sometimes you might say, no, you definitely need to see so and so, but do you want to go Tuesday or Wednesday? Do you know what I mean? You're building choice into it so that people feel still that they have some sense of control over what's happening next. So I think that's really important, that they're part of it. I think it's, you can't push people into things. You want to be alongside them and help guide them towards whatever the support is that they need next. And I think, we're talking about maybe going from either the office of their personal tutor to booking an appointment with the wellbeing advisors or the, assessment team or whatever, then being alongside them as they do it, helping them to know what the steps are, guiding them through it. That, I think that's all, very positive and supportive. I'm not saying do it for them, which is different, but I'm saying, did you know that there's a form that you need to fill in? They always, they should respond to you within this amount of time, and you can choose, when you go, and that sort of thing. If you can frame it for them so that they can visualize what might need to be done, you take away some of that uncertainty. So I think it's just really helpful and that applies, whatever level. When I was a GP referring to outpatients, I would say, well, you'll get a letter or an email, and then they'll call you in, and that first appointment will just be a chat and And I think just taking away that uncertainty can be really, really helpful. So the steps really involve a conversation that is explaining to them, hopefully they understand that they might need some extra support, but that humans are not solitary creatures. We need other humans to help us. And the fact is that we all need a bit of help sometimes. And I think just normalizing that and framing it that way will allow them to recognize that whilst they may feel they're the only person going through this, very nicely saying, the university is used to dealing with things like this, and they may not have seen exactly your particular situation, because everyone does want to be unique in some way, but they will have dealt with similar things before, and they're familiar with this, and they're specially trained, and they literally come to work every day to help with these sorts of issues. And I think that can be reassuring. And then, of course, the next bit is checking in with them, that referral, that appointment, whatever happened and how it went, light touch if that's what feels appropriate, but just making people feel valued and remembered is really powerful as well.
And I think from then, so I suppose it is like after that referral, and then the next steps is then if they kind of were to return to university and integrating back into that student lifestyle, but also the university landscape as it is, Dom, is how do, I know that, like I said at the beginning, universities are doing so much, potentially even the people that are attending today are doing so much to help students, and we absolutely admire the work that they're already doing, even if they're only impacting one individual's life. Like you said, Dom, they're kind of seeing these things happen all of the time, but even if it's just one individual that they're helping can have a ripple effect on all the rest of the students. But how going forward? So I know that we've spoken about kind of the signs and symptoms to look out for, how to initiate those really difficult conversations, the ones of those that are maybe kind of struggling kind of in their shell a little bit, whereas those that are kind of outwardly talking about it, to then the referral process. Well, what about, what is kind of this supportive environment at universities? I know, like we said, universities are working very hard, but how and what can individuals do in their role that they play at the university to create a more supportive environment for students?
I mean, I feel like there are a lot of things that people can do. I think they'll probably be very familiar with some of these concepts, but I always think, it's okay. So the first and most obvious is removing stigma. So we like to think we've come a long way. I think we have come a long way. God knows it isn't the 80s or 70s anymore, which I remember. I'm sure not everybody here does. But we have come a long way from that. But we still have way to go with removing stigma and normalizing the fact that, people will have struggles, and, sometimes we need that help to thrive, not just survive. So anywhere we can just normalize conversations around well-being, mental health, that's great. I don't think we have to be talking about it all the time, but I do think it is important to just normalize it. So that's the stigma stuff. Really important. I think removing barriers to getting help, that has really come on in leaps and bounds over the last few years. People are making it, but the very hardworking staff in universities are making it much easier to seek advice, guidance, support. We're talking about, no wrong door approaches. So it doesn't matter where you ask for help, you'll get help, even if it's just to point you carefully and gently towards the right person, hubs, and so on. So I think that is really important. Get rid of the barriers to getting help. Don't make it hard. They've made the decision, they want some help, and then they can't get it. And then I think in terms of the kind of everyday, how do we help people? I've talked a bit before about a compassionate campus approach. I'm a big fan in compassion being part of everybody's activities, not just the well-being and mental health teams, but that everybody, it doesn't matter where you work in a university, can think even briefly as they go about their day, how does what I'm doing, and it might be planning the exam timetable, how does this impact on people's well-being, and how can we potentially make it less negative if that's what needs to happen? So I think there's the whole compassionate campus thing, that we can all try to think about how we impact other people. And then if I have to pick one more thing, I'm going to go with the making every contact matter, which is advocated by some of the big names in suicide prevention, but I actually think it plays out in all fields of mental health and wellbeing, which is that every time we are in contact with someone else, we can have an impact, and we can have a positive impact. It doesn't have to be transformational, but cumulatively it may be. But that when we see people and we smile and we are welcoming and we make them feel included and that they belong, all of those contacts matter and are really powerful. And I think I personally feel very positive that that's the way that the sector is moving. But, there will always be room for improvement for lots of us. But, I feel like we still have to remember that whole make every contact matter in a positive way.
I think like what you said, Dom, even just, I know this is something so small, but even just a smile, or, just holding the door open for somebody, or just being around, and kind of, even, I suppose, because we're all human, we all navigate mental health. One of us has mental health, we've all got it. So I think even just like you said, just smiling can really uplift someone's day, and maybe even start a conversation in terms of kind of if they are struggling with their mental health. And I think that is one of the ways of kind of, like you said, providing that supportive environment, because if they have moved away from home, and like you said, post-pandemic, we're still kind of living in that side of things. People are still trying to navigate that, but being away. So with the open conversations in mental health on campus, I know you said kind of the smiling and having this supportive environment, but how can we encourage more open conversations, particularly with the students that maybe are adapting, that are struggling with anxiety, but also those that are kind of navigating at home, don't really want to leave their home environment or what is kind of their new home. And those that are actually quite prevalent on the campus and are excited to do all the different activities and the freshers fairs and things like that. How do we actually even have those more open conversations? You've got all those resources to providing a more supportive environment, but then what next?
I mean, I think this is where, universities are doing an enormous amount, but it's one of the topics that is really interesting to see where it goes, is communicating that information about support and so on to specific groups. So there are particular groups of people, of students, who struggle. So I think where we've come from is to be having the conversations at all, to be talking about mental health and wellbeing openly, to make services, more visible. That has been happening, I would say, probably 5 to 10 years now. And as I said, there's always, room to go further. But what perhaps we're doing next is looking at specific demographics, specific groups of people who need additional support. Maybe they're managing more than one challenge in life. So whether you call that being, an intersectional approach or just life is complicated, of course. But I think it's really, important. And lots of universities are working on some fantastic projects that particularly address the concerns, say, of Black students at university, or of international students, or of students on, who are neurodiverse. So I think the key is that we keep talking to the students and asking them where they see the gaps, where they feel more help could be required. And it might be for themselves, but it might be that they've noticed that some of their friends are struggling. So I think that's probably where we're going with the conversation. Is we've brought the big open wide conversation, and now we might need to narrow it down and focus it and tailor it for specific groups to make it more accessible or understandable or relatable to them.
Absolutely. I think the conversation that we've had, Dom, has been hopefully so meaningful. I know that for me as a student, it's so nice to hear, well, as a previous student, to know kind of the universities are really taking that next step in the right direction with the support, of course, of you, Dom, and kind of the other surrounding resources. I think it's absolutely incredible. And I think what you've kind of discussed, kind of all the different tips and tricks, but also just highlighting what people are already doing, what they can kind of just add on to what they're already doing to make it even better and stronger and more impactful, for lasting impact. Because I think it is essentially, students won't be students forever. We're always a student because we're always learning things, but essentially it's kind of supporting them and giving them the tools and resources for beyond. So beyond the university, like you said, Dom, and being able to give them that confidence and hope to then take that next step after the campus life. So I think now might be time to kind of open up the questions. If anybody's got any questions, no question is a silly question, and that's why we have Dom here to answer all of them. If you've got any question at all, whether it's to do with the mental health, whether it's to do with anything that Dom has covered in this talk, whether it's to do with her student wellbeing series books or the Trigger Hub products, please pop them in the chat function, and of course we will answer them as we're finishing at past today. But whilst we're waiting for Dom for those questions to come through, if we have any, I would love to really talk more about your student wellbeing series of books that we have currently on Trigger Publishing, so on our Trigger Hub site. I know that with Trigger Hub, we're more than just a source of information. We're a true community here at Trigger Hub that feels confident, we spark hope, and we significantly fast track those that are struggling in silence, but also we provide wisdom from those that have already walked that same path through the power of lived experience, through our memoirs, through our books, for our incredible toolkits on Bibliospace, but more importantly, Dom, through your student wellbeing series. I'd love for you to just maybe talk very briefly about what that series is, how it provides support, and how maybe wellbeing leads and also those that are kind of wanting to provide that resource to students, how can they utilise those books?
I mean, the books came because after, as you said, about 20 years of being a GP to students, specifically looking after students, I felt like, there was a lot of information that I was either giving out to them or feeling that they might find helpful, that I was sort of repeat. And so it was a practical idea to get down into currently 5 little books, specific top tips and useful, things that students might like to know before either they arrive at university or whilst they're there. Whether it's specifically, like we have one on anxiety and one on depression, which is about specifically living and managing those at university. There's the one about risk-taking behaviours, and it covers, drugs, alcohol, eating issues, and general just risk-taking and how that can affect your mental health. And then the other 2 are more about, well, one is about getting through the whole of that first year and all the ups and downs and the things that students don't always expect, like the midterm blues is a thing, and how to manage it and get ahead of it, and so the sort of the whole track of the year through that. And then the resourcefulness one is the stuff that can go wrong in life. So dealing with people, money, academic challenges, perfectionism, all of those sorts of things, which I think, as you said, are life skills. So I'm hoping, and I'm told they are very practical. They're very easy to sort of pick up and dip in and out of, with lots of top tips, little techniques, that sort of thing. And they're backpack sized, so they fit neatly in your backpack, but also on a shelf, and they don't have to take up a load of space. And I gather that universities use them in all sorts of different ways. So some buy them in bulk and give them out at, the sort of welcome fair, or at the beginning of term, at the beginning of courses. Others buy them and put them in their accommodation. Some of them are in the libraries. Others stock them in their on-campus bookshop directly for the students to get if they want. So, I mean, I'm always pleased when I hear that they've been useful, because I like nothing better in life than to be useful to people in my work. So that's why I like them. I think I enjoyed writing them, but I'm really hoping that they are practical and useful for students and the people who support students.
And like you said, Dom, they fit in a backpack, but we also have the digital version available
Yes.
via our Biblio app. So you can give access students to our Biblio app service, which is essentially an app that's available on the go on your phone. And when you purchase multiple books, they're all available on there, alongside lots of articles, inspiring videos, audio therapy collection. This app is jam-packed. Same with our Bibliospace platform. But if you want more information about our products and the amazing Dom's books, please get in touch with Gemma at triggerhub.org. Her details have been populated in the comment section. But we do actually have a question, Dom, that's come through. Yep. From Laura. So hi, Laura. When assessing a student's presentation in a first meeting via an online platform, so Teams/Zoom, what aspects of how they appear, behave, so grooming, effect and engagement, would be the most telling that they are in the midst of a crisis? In my role, I often only have online access to students.
Really interesting. Yes. I think for me, we have to remember that non-verbal cues are probably, what you're going to be picking up on without even always being aware of it, because you'll be a highly trained individual. So you'll be picking up on all those non-verbal cues, and that's lack of eye contact, lack of actual just movement. When people, for example, are depressed, all their movements are depressed. They stop responding. Their facial expressions become flat. That's what we mean, perhaps, when we talk about a flat affect. They become very, much more withdrawn. So you're going to notice things like that. You're going to notice if there's a lack of smiling, if their voice tone is down or whispering or anxious. You may, of course, notice more obvious things like tics and movement disorders, which we've seen a huge increase in since the pandemic, going up alongside the anxiety. And of course, then you've got things like their sort of, as you say, their general personal grooming and ability to care for themselves. So I think, there is so much we can still pick up. I don't think it's ideal if we're not seeing people in person. I understand that is sometimes the way things work out, because for me, when I was working in my GP room, consulting room, and people were walking across the room to me, I could tell also from their gait, the way they walked, the way they held themselves, the way they sat in the chair, all of those issues as well. But I think you can do an awful lot with an online visual assessment, as well as obviously the conversation. So I hope that is reassuring to you, that you can still get an awful lot from just that interaction online.
And I think even the fact, on like we discussed prior to actually jumping on this, was that the fact that people are even showing up to a trigger talk like this shows that they care. They really care about creating that impact. They're almost concerned about what's the next steps. How can they be adding to kind of their treasure trove of tools and kind of tips and tricks of what they can use with students. And I think that's quite admirable, actually, to know that so many people have signed up. because they actually care. They want to know what they can do next.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that naturally brings us to a close, Dom. I just wanted to thank you on behalf of Trigger Hub for all of the support that you continue to provide us, but all of the kind of the inspiration that you provide to everybody else. I'm sure everybody that's watching could agree that we appreciate you and that we absolutely love the work that you do. And in Trigger Hub, of course, you'll find a treasure trove of insights and wisdom from those who have journeyed the same path. So again, like I referenced before, is the power of lived experience that in Dom's books, that is kind of peppered throughout. Some of kind of those lived experience insights and stories and snippets. But at Trigger Hub, we're more than just a resource. We're a community, like I said, that fosters confidence and kindles hope, significantly accelerating the access to recovery. So together, let's shorten that journey, let's brighten the path, and let's please empower recovery starting today. So if you'd love to hear more about our Trigger Hub products, or of course Dr. Dom's books, please get in touch with us via the website or through gemma@triggerhub.org. And thank you so much again, Dom. I'm super excited to have another conversation very soon. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's been great. I hope it's been useful to people. Thank you.